President Metsola, on the conflict between Israel and Gaza, the EU's chief diplomat, Josep Borrell, has said the way we deal with this crisis will define the EU's credibility and global role for years to come. How much influence does the European Union really have when it comes to this conflict?
Well, it is clearly a defining moment. The European Union needs to be able to respond in real time, first in stating in the most clear of manners that the atrocities of the 7th of October are to be condemned, that these atrocities cannot find their place in our Europe, in our world, in a world where we woke up on the 7th of October and realized that everything we've been working for, I would say for decades, have seen a complete step back. Similarly, how we respond, how Israel responds to these atrocities, and I saw these atrocities in first hand in October when I visited last week. How we respond matters. In other words, are we making sure that we make it as clear as possible that Hamas is a terror organization? It does not represent the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. How are we going to make sure that the necessary humanitarian aid goes through, that we allow for the possibility of movement, that we also see that innocent civilians do not become the victims?
So those are the questions, but what can you actually do?
Well, we condemn in the clearest of manners the attack that took place. We call for the response to be against Hamas. We call to make sure that innocent civilians do not get caught in the crossfire, and we make sure and we do everything we can in our power to respond to the calls of our Middle Eastern partners in asking us, look, we need help in this case, we need help with people, we need help with food, we need help with supplies, while at the same time understanding that what happened on the 7th of October needs a response.
The European Parliament has called for a humanitarian peace in Gaza to provide food, medicines and water to the people there. What can you actually do to make sure that happens?
Well, we welcome the fact that since the adoption of that resolution, there has been trucks that were allowed into Gaza that have been permitted to arrive to the people who are so desperately in need of them. It's nowhere near enough. There needs to be more. There is also a discussion as to how, when there is the operations, in other words, to defeat Hamas, that is done in order to allow, as I would say, that Hamas does not use its civilians as human shields. We have called in the clearest of ways for the release of the 200 hostages kept by Hamas. These are not futile words. These are words that we make as a European elected institution. We do it together with the heads of state and government, together with the other EU institutions, in making it clear also when we see what is happening on the ground in our countries, when we see synagogues being targeted, when we see the appeal for more aid to go in. And this is our response by making sure that our messages get through.
You mentioned the European institutions. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was praised by Israel's ambassador to the EU for keeping criticism of Israel behind closed doors, while Chief Diplomat Borrell has been much more vocal in criticising Israel. Is the European Union, are the institutions, speaking with one voice?
Well, that is definitely always our appeal as the European Parliament, in order for us to be coherent and consistent in what we say and what we do. What I can say as someone who has been to Israel and went on the ground and spoke to its president and the speaker of its parliament is that the message was very clear, that solidarity was expressed, that condemnation against Hamas's acts were expressed, and in a request for the response to keep in mind the mitigation of the humanitarian consequences. That is what was discussed inside the European Parliament last week, together with the President of the Commission, with her announcement of the increase and the tripling of the humanitarian aid, together with the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, but also together with the President of the European Council and the European Council that we had last week, where heads of state and government came together and put these messages together in order to send the strongest of messages, first of support, of condemnation, and of call for more aid to go through.
So there is unity?
I would say there is.
How alarmed are you about the possibility of a wider regional conflict across the Middle East?
Yeah, I am alarmed. This is also something that is being expressed by many of the leaders in the Middle East. We need to also see the role that Iran is playing with fire, if I could use those words literally, while brave women in Iran are standing up for their liberties and their life. I am worried of sympathy between terrorist groups, that this could flare up and push back what I would have said were great developments in these countries who never used to talk to each other have started to talk to each other. I hope for that to continue. The Cairo Peace Summit last weekend showed a glimmer of hope in that regard. We will be meeting with the leaders also inside the European Parliament of many of the countries, and I've met with their representatives as well, and that was a message I received and one that we share.
Do you see a danger that this conflict could trigger a wave of new refugees, many of whom would come to Europe, where migration is already such a strained issue?
I would see this as the need for the European Union to adopt a migration package. Now is the moment. There are glaring loopholes. We have shown, on the other hand, how we can give refuge to people, like in the Ukraine war, for 7 million Ukrainians who found a home in the European Union. We have seen that our politics of return to countries of origin for persons not eligible for asylum, that is not working. We have seen that solidarity between member states is not working. We have seen that the instinct of member states is to reintroduce internal borders rather than to dismantle them, in a way work back on the freedom of movement that we ourselves cherish so much as a European Union, while at the same time recognizing the need, and this is uniform, of strengthening and reinforcing the external border. This is where we have no more time to lose. I will go this Thursday to the European Council with this message. Our citizens have asked us to resolve this at the European level. This is a European challenge that requires a European response, and it is in that context that we will be able to, once adopted, look at how we deal with potential future crises that we will be faced with, or influxes.
How concerned are you about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe? We've seen threats against synagogues, anti-Semitic slogans. How concerned are you about this, and what can be done to combat it?
I'm very concerned. We saw what happened in Tunisia. We saw with the synagogue. We see synagogues across the European Union, memorials of the Holocaust that are barricaded, protests that are taking place that turn violent into anti-Semitic chants, similar to flags being waved that are ISIS flags, that are, remind us of a very, very recent terrorist past in the European Union. These are things that worry us a lot. At the same time, I think we need to be clear in making sure that Jewish communities in our European Union are protected, that our minorities are protected, that there is tolerance, and that this does not spiral down into the hatred that we are seeing, not only embedded but rising up again in our societies, which is very, very, I would say, concerning and scary even.
Final question. Are you worried that attention on the conflict in the Middle East will draw focus away from Russia's war in Ukraine?
That is exactly what Putin would want, and that is something we will not do. The European Parliament and the European Union is very clear on this. Ukraine remains at the very top of our agenda. Ukrainians are fighting not only for their life and for their land, but for our values and our security. As we take the next steps in order to see whether we can go further for Ukraine and Moldova to become accession countries, where we next start to negotiate accession of them into the European Union, we look back and see that we are more united than ever before, and continue to have that unity in order to send the strongest of messages to President Putin that this is not something we will let him do, exploit the situation.
President Metsola, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.